ma'am, I want you to remember something about admiration. A big part of pure admiration is respect. Anybody who does not respect you can't admire you. I'd like to come up to share with you what I thought was a solid conversation with a new client. It's my hope that what I share with her is a help to you, the way it was to her. She's 38 years old. She is the mother of 3 sons and has been divorced for 3 years after a 12-year marriage. She came to me and said, Doc, I'm coming because I need you to help me work through my grief. I saw one of the lives that you did on grief and how to process the 5 stages of grief. And I'm really struggling with the grief associated with my divorce. I said, well, what's going on? What happened? She said, well, in a nutshell, I caught him having an affair with the same woman twice over a 4-year period of time. After I caught him the first time, I decided to try to make the marriage work as he begged and pleaded for me to do so. And then I ended up catching him again about a year later with the same woman. And I ended up staying, in essence, 2 more years or so from that point before deciding to finally leave the marriage. She said, Doc, he's a public official. And because he's a public official, and because of the type of job and career that he has, he ended up losing his job. He not only lost his job as a result of this affair that became public knowledge, because the woman also exposed him to his employer. And this is what caused the snowball effect of him losing his job. I said, what did she do? She said, well, in essence, she didn't know about her and my client did not know about the woman. I said, he's a public official? She said, yes, sir. I said, how did she not know about you? She said, well, Doc, it probably sounds unbelievable, but if you were to search my name on the internet or search his name, there are no images of them together. He never posted them. There is a clean internet search online when it comes to search history with his name. If you even typed his name and typed the word wife, you wouldn't see any images of her show up or of their children. And she said that she discovered later on after the fact, just in talking to some coworkers who reached out to her once they heard of the divorce or the affair rather, and him losing his job, that a few of the coworkers said, yeah, he never really wore his ring out of the home. Like every time he was in the office, we never saw him with his ring on, and we knew he was married, but he never wore it. So they just figured, a lot of the coworkers just figured that it was just another man that didn't wear his ring. And she said, Doc, I know this sounds bizarre because you're probably thinking in your mind, why am I struggling to grieve a marriage with a man who cheated twice? I said, no, I'm not. I don't think people really recognize that grief doesn't necessarily always have something to do with fault. You can absolutely struggle with grieving something that you were not completely to blame for. And I said, ma'am, this doesn't suggest, and she wasn't suggesting this, but I said to her, this doesn't suggest that you are without blame for something. I'm sure in any situation, we all could do something better. So I'm not suggesting that you could not have done something better in the marriage. But what I am suggesting is that an underrated part of grief is that it doesn't require blame in order for you to grieve. Remember, the word grief simply means to process loss. So anytime we're grieving something, we're just processing the loss of it. And it has nothing to do with blame. And it has everything to do with the fact that we've lost something, whether you were at fault or you were not. I said, does that make sense? She said, it makes perfect sense. And I'll take it a step further. I am struggling with the divorce because I'm really accepting the pain associated with the divorce. I said, that makes perfect sense to me. That divorce is one of those things that even if you're not at fault or a person was obviously at fault, for lack of a better way of putting it, I said to her, the very fact that you're losing a partner, it feels like you're losing a part of you. Even if that marriage was bad, and it sounds like at least the last 4 years of the marriage was bad. She said it was more than the last 4 years. You know, he really was starting to get disrespectful and rude as his career was climbing up. And I would say the last 7 to 8 years of the marriage were bad. And yes, I continued to have children. I wanted this to work. I tried to be a good wife, but apparently I wasn't enough. And she started to cry on the call. Gave her an opportunity to gather herself. And I said, ma'am, I understand where you're coming from. I said, just tell me quickly, why is this really hurting so bad besides the fact that you are grieving the loss? She said, because Doc, I really thought that he loved me and I thought that he admired me. And one of the things that he would always say to me is how much he admired the kind of woman that I was and tried to be for him and his family. I said, even though he was disrespectful and not a great husband the last 7 or 8 years, she said, yes, sir. Even though he wasn't that, he would still occasionally say that to me, and that always stuck with me. I said, well, ma'am, I want you to remember something about admiration. A big part of pure admiration is respect. Anybody who does not respect you can't admire you. And we've got to be very honest about this, because when we truly admire anything, respect comes with it. And if we say we admire something, but we don't respect it, it's almost like another form of limerence. We're in love with the idea of admiring someone, but really at our core, we really don't respect who they are. And so sometimes people like your ex-husband might say things like that, but in the same action, turn around and mistreat you and treat you bad. But this sends mixed signals in your mind because they're saying these things, but doing something else. It's because they're in love with the idea of admiring you, but really don't possess the tools necessary to fully admire you. I said, does that make sense? She cried. She said, yes, sir, it does. I said, so ultimately, the way we beat this is simple. I said, at the end of the day, you can get to the place of acceptance when you know you've done all you can. I said, ma'am, in this marriage, can you honestly say you did everything that you can to try to make it work? She said, yes, sir, I feel like I have. I agree with you earlier where you said, I'm not perfect. I don't think anybody's perfect, but I absolutely put effort into our marriage. I recommended counseling and therapy. He didn't want it after the affair. And I stayed a little bit longer and then just decided to go. But I recommended that. I tried for us. I wanted us to work on ourselves. I wanted us to work on ourselves together. I wanted the kids to get therapy if necessary. I said, are your kids familiar with the affair? She said they were, and learned of it. And my concern was that it bothered them. I said, well, ma'am, I'm going to make this real easy. Let me give you an easy analogy that makes this make sense. In my years, I've been privileged to counsel people who have had to work with situations where they had a family member, say, on a respirator or life support. And typically when you are counseling family members who have a loved one on life support, or perhaps they've been given, 2-3 weeks to live, it's a very challenging situation for people to be in mentally and emotionally, and in many ways, even spiritually too. I said, but ma'am, there are typically two different scenarios when you're in that position. I said, number one, you typically have the family who left a lot undone. And these are family members who, let's say, have a family member on life support and the doctor says, hey, there's nothing else we can do. The machine is the only thing that's keeping your loved one alive, and there's really nothing we can do. Well, I've seen family members literally keep those loved ones on the machine and pay the money to keep them on the machine for substantial periods of time. Why? My client said, because they were probably trying to just make up for lost time. I said, that's exactly what they were trying to do. I said, and a lot of times when you have those families that leave a lot undone or have left a lot undone, when it comes to a person in that position, they will really extend life support in an effort of trying to make up for time that they cannot make up for. Once we lose time, we can't get it back, man. I said, and those families are very tough to counsel through. Why? Because you have to get them to come to grips with the reality that if they could have made some changes and done some things differently in the past that perhaps could have helped this family member not be in this position, or if that family member themselves could have done some things differently that would have caused them not to be in that position, there's nothing that can be done about it now. There's nothing. And all they are doing is delaying the inevitable because they don't want to face what? She said, the pain of loss. I said, exactly. I said, but ma'am, I don't think you're in that scenario. I said, I think you're in scenario number two. I said, the second type of family that I typically deal with is the family who did all they could. She started to smile. You could still see a tear coming down her eyes, but you could almost see the tension of the conversation starting to lift immediately. I said, this family is interesting because I've counseled this type of family before, and typically the conversation is different. This conversation typically goes something like, Doc, my family member's been given a few days to live, and we have to meet with as a family tonight to decide if we're going to keep him or her on the respirator. And we feel pretty confident that we're just going to move on. I said, ma'am, do you understand why those family members come to those conclusions? She wiped her face and said, Doc, it's because they realized they did everything in their power to try to help their loved one. I said, exactly. I said, but not only that, there's an underrated element to this decision from these types of family members. I said, ma'am, family members arrive at peace a lot easier with that decision when they know they've done everything that they can. This family member that was on the respirator maybe was in dialysis or some type of long-term medical treatment. They were running them to appointments, taking them to all of their physician appointments, ensuring that they had proper diet and nutrition. They were making sure that they did everything that the doctors told him or her to do. When a family member's done all that they can do, there's really nothing else left to do. I said, ma'am, did you do everything that you could do in this marriage to save it? She said, I did. I said, was there anything left undone that you should have done that you did not do? She said, I did not. I said, well, ma'am, let me just give you an element of this that people miss. I said, if you do not pull the plug regarding your emotional attachment to this marriage, you can actually risk losing more over something that could never be saved. I said, ma'am, your marriage couldn't be saved, but what's the more? She looked confused. I said, you don't know what the more is? She said, I don't. I said, it's your kids. I said, how old are your kids again? She said, Doc, they're 11, 7, and 6. I said, so that means the 11-year-old knew about the affair. I said, do you think the 7-year-old knows? She said, I'm pretty sure he does. I said, what about the 6? She said, I think he does too. I said, why? I said, who found out about it firsthand? She said, the 11-year-old. I said, how did the 7 and 6-year-old find out? She said, probably my 11-year-old told them. We've had conversations about it. I'm pretty sure of it. I said, so if you would have continued to stay in this marriage, watching 3 young men watch their father continuously cheat on their mom, what could you have lost in this situation? She started to tear up a little bit. I said, ma'am, neither one of these decisions are easy. Whether you could have done more to rescue the person on life support, or if you did more than your share to rescue them. I said, neither one is easy. I said, but ma'am, don't you ever forget this. Grief is easier to manage and move on from when it's been supported by full effort. And when you have been giving something your full effort, and there has to be a disconnect, you can live with the consequences of grief a lot better when you know you gave it all that you can. I said, but beyond that, we risk damaging these boys even more so over a marriage that simply couldn't be rescued. I said, now, if you didn't make full effort, be honest about where you fell short. I have clients in your position that did not make the full effort in marriages, and those marriages fell apart and they're grieving. And I tell them, be honest about where you fell short, make the adjustments, repair the adjustments and the shortfalls, get yourself up, accept it, and move forward. I said, but ma'am, if you've done all you can, there's literally nothing else left to do but to accept pulling the plug and moving forward. She completely understood, so gracious in the conversation. She's working on the stages of grief, and doing really, really well and making great progress. I hope this story made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you.